Recording. Okay. So I'll start. So thank you first for being here today. However virtual the contact, and I know a lot of us will have been bemoaning the lack of interaction IRL, you know, in real life. There is something very material, very real in making the time to meet and to pay attention to each other and to share ideas in this way. And for that effort, we're incredibly grateful for, so thank you all for being here today. We also pray to the gods of tech and the internet that they may look down favorably on our endeavors today. And we promise that we will do our utmost not to leave you somewhere lost in cyberspace should any technical difficulty arise. So here goes, bear with us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Diane Leblond and I'm a lecturer at the University of Lorraine in France. And I'll be your host today, as this was originally meant to take place in Metz. I'll be opening the series as well, but my collaborators Sarah and Estelle are here, of course, and acting as co-hosts. And just one technical note as far as questions are concerned, we'll have a Q&A at the end of the panel. But meanwhile, if you can write your questions in the chat box, or you can keep them in mind and just raise your hand at the end and ask them yourselves if you'd rather do that. Both options completely available, and yeah. So yeah. This, as you might know, is part of a wider project on how the challenge to anthropocentrism implies for humanities and human sciences to reposition themselves. And this is the first leg of the project, in which we look at that displaced, decentered sense of the human by considering our non-human companions and our non-human extensions. So we're trying to sort of grab something of that constant centripetal movement of humankind, which is forever steering towards the non-human. For the next axis to the project, which will have to do with our coordinates within space and time and our position within the order of material things, respectively, I will refer you to the website of our project, which is right now on your screen. In this inaugural moment of our exchanges, I thought to raise the questions as they presented themselves to us. And I hope that this paper will serve that purpose, while knowing that, thankfully, if it doesn't do the job, we have a wonderful series of papers lined up to make up for that. So again, bear with us. My aim here will be to outline the questions that bring us together today, and perhaps the beginnings of an answer. And the shape I've given this paper is not that of a theoretical introduction, for the aim for us is to ask the questions through our practice as humanities and human science scholars. So as a reader by trade, I recruited the help of a master storyteller, Jeanette Winterson, so that she might give substance to what I wanted to say. Our questions, therefore, will unfold from an interpretation of Jeanette Winterson's novel, Frankenstein. So here we go. So first, to give you a very rough idea of the novel, Frankenstein bridges two main timelines, which it pursues alternatively across 2 centuries. So in a series of prolepses and analepses, the narrative brings us from the life of Mary Shelley, focusing especially on the summer of 1816, when she first had the idea for her novel Frankenstein. So from the life of Mary Shelley to a certain Dr. Rye Shelley, Rye for Ryan, as most characters mistakenly assume, it's actually Rye for Mary. So in contemporary times, Dr. Rye Shelley investigating the psychological and cognitive impact of our relationship to tech and to robots in particular. And we follow Rye as he meets and falls in love with Dr. Victor Stein, a very vocal and visible proponent of the enhancement of human bodies and the advancement of AI. So the suggestion, obviously, is that the author and her creature travel through time and are brought together again and again. And when we first meet Victor Stein, he's giving a lecture at the Royal Society on the future of life forms and the transition from evolution-driven species to partially self-designing species, such as ours. And he's considering the promise of fully self-designing life in the form of AI. And because Dr. Stein is much more of a master in the art of presentation than I am, he, quote, has a big following on Facebook and Twitter, and his TED Talk has netted 6 million views, unquote. So because he's that master of presentation, I thought I would plunder from his work and first look at the perfect use he makes of visual aids. Behind him on the screen is Leonardo's drawing of the Vitruvian Man. As the audience sits in silence, Leonardo's image animates itself, takes an appearing trilby from an appearing peg, and placing it on the back of his head, turns and walks into an appearing sea. The sound of the waves can be heard clearly. The image of the man walks without pausing until the waters reach his head. All that is left behind is the hat floating calmly on the indifferent sea. Victor Stein smiled. He walked forward, turning back to his screen. He said, I call this lecture The Future of Humans in a Post-Human World because artificial intelligence is not sentimental. It is biased towards best possible outcomes. The human race is not a best possible outcome, unquote. So what the animation achieves here is the visual equivalent to that intellectual efforts that we've described as deconstructing anthropocentrism. In Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, Winterson, or rather Stein, found an immensely familiar, perfectly emblematic embodiment of the tendency we've inherited to put man at the center of the world. I hope you'll note this was also our choice of frontispiece for the Humanities After Humans project, so phew, we seem to be in sync for now. Inscribed within the circle and square, the shape of the male human body is both our main point of focus and the apparent basis from which we may ambition to apprehend reality through mathematics on the one hand, circle, square, through representations and the arts on the other. However, in this case, the image is no longer static. Through the help of CGI, it turns away and leaves, just simply disappears. Exit humanity, therefore. And indeed, this is the point of Stein's lecture and the challenge posed to us by technological developments and the apparition of such categories as the post-human, to make us consider a world that no longer revolves around us humans. And though this is presented with a smile, there's a clear sense that this must constitute a bit of a rude awakening for humans. At least those in the audience tend to object quite forcefully, with one shouting at some point, "What is so smart about the end of the human?" And to be sure, in the lecture, the disappearance of man as the center is immediately connected with the erasure of a narcissistic illusion, that is, the illusion of humans' superiority and exception as a species. The portrait Stein draws is far from the geometrical, mathematical, aesthetic perfection suggested by the Renaissance drawing. As he points out, quote, in the previous slide, the human race is not a best possible outcome. And through such a statement, we're not the best possible outcome, our exception is well and truly negated. Not only are we not the apex of life, we're not even its symmetrical opposite, the worst that existence can bring out. As Victor puts it, science, which tries to deal in realities, not magical thinking, is no longer convinced that Homo sapiens is a special case, unquote. A post-human world, therefore, is one in which we know that, quote, frogs, potatoes, humans can be understood as biological data processing plants, where computers are non-biological data processing plants, so that, quote, humans aren't so special after all. They're just, biological algorithms. However, the intensity of feelings aroused by the presentation isn't what we would expect from the realization that Homo sapiens are, after all, just an ordinary sort of species. And that's because in questioning the centrality and exceptionality of mankind, Stein isn't just re-establishing a balance, putting us back in our place. He's questioning the very foundations of what his audience and we have been given to understand as human. Hence the paradox of his title, Humans in a Post-Human World, which doesn't fool anyone really. In a post-human world, we feel we would get the end of the human. There is something there of the challenge posed to humanities and human sciences when they have to grapple with the notion that what humanity has done with its superior understanding is just to turn into a self-destructive species. That explains the way Wittgenstein characterizes the human that's left and the consolation that we might humbly find in acknowledging other best possible outcomes. Quote, "Is that so terrible a piece of knowledge? Perhaps it comes as a relief. We haven't been wonderful as masters of the universe, have we? Climate change, mass extinction of fauna and flora, destruction of habitat and wilderness, atmospheric pollution, failure to control population, extraordinary brutality, the daily stupidity of our childish feelings. If we are reaching the end of Project Human, don't blame the geeks." There's a loud cheer from the geeks in the room. So who or what can we blame this on then? A recurrent motif in Stein's idea of a brave new post-human world is our own failure to meet the standards of perfection that we set ourselves. What appears there between the lines is the paradox which the novel designates as the human dream. Stein's disillusionment with humanity as a species means that he can consider completely dispassionately the quote-unquote optimal option of putting it behind us and entering a post-human future. Interestingly, this lack of tolerance for anything less than ideal outcomes finds resonance in the Doctor's transhumanist creed. Victor met our first-person narrator, Ry Shelley, at the Alcohol Life Extension Foundation, a facility famously dedicated to the cryopreservation of humans. And he describes his work as teaching machines how to diagnose the human condition. And when Ry picks up on the pun, stating that as a doctor, he has no idea how to diagnose the human condition, much less how to cure it, Victor suggests to end death, a feat that he points out is only impossible for biological organisms. His enthusiastic assessment of artificial intelligence and the direction that it might take life into finds an echo in what he calls the human dream, the paradox of a human existence enhanced out of itself, optimized into something other, something trans or post-human, something not bound by the limitations of embodiment and finitude. Quote, "However we enhance our biology, we're still inside a body. To be free from the body completes the human dream." This paradoxical dimension of the human dream doesn't seem very promising for the humanities, right? If the best humanity can aspire to is to optimize itself into oblivion, then what use could be fields of knowledge and discourse specifically dedicated to all things human? And it gets even worse because there might be reason to think that those same discourses play a part in that process. Though Victor Stein mainly brings up the STEM fields, so science, tech, engineering, and mathematics, the critical gesture that challenges anthropocentrism actually comes in large part from their HASS, the Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and their questioning of a liberal humanist model of thought that presided over the elaboration of the scientific method itself. So the question is, in critiquing the object and deconstructing its supposed centrality, are the humanities and human sciences not constantly running the risk of making themselves obsolete, making themselves irrelevant? Between the work of Victor Stein and that of Ry Shelley, a doctor whom we first encounter at the Global Tech Expo on robotics, the novel covers a lot of our contemporary questions on what place to give the human, if any, in the face of accelerated technological advancement. The narrative brings up the usual suspects of post and transhuman futures, from sex bots and intelligent vibrators, to Max More, The Singularity, Nick Bostrom and the Future of Humanity Institute, and brain emulation. In such a context, what contribution might humanities scholars still hope to make? You know, their object has all but disappeared. Yet though the novel insists on its own topicality and contemporariness, its evocation of our companionship with tech, of our attempts at cheating death, its evocation of the possibility of AI and the evolution of non-biological life forms, all of those issues also connect with our history as a storytelling species. Indeed, all these are matters that have roots in the myths and stories that we have been telling for centuries, one of which prominently figures as a hypertext for the novel. So as Rai points out, the Tech Expo was organized in Memphis, a city founded in 1819, when, quote, Frankenstein was a year old. So let's take that route and see whether the novel points us in the direction of productive rather than just self-defeating critiques of the human. Via Frankenstein, the novel brings us to an origin story that stresses the complexity of what we call the human in light of our relationship to technology. I'm obviously referring to the myth that provided the subtitle for Mary Shelley's novel, The Modern Prometheus. Prometheus shows up at various points in Frankissstein. The novel reminds us, for instance, of the punishment meted to the Titan for stealing the god's fire and giving it to humankind. And the novel also evokes the measures taken against humanity through Prometheus's sister-in-law Pandora. But the original reason for Prometheus's misdeed, that is Epimetheus's forgetfulness in distributing physical characteristics between animal species, that doesn't appear as a narrative within the novel. Rather, it lets itself be read between the lines in a portrait that Mary Shelley draws of herself as a human and therefore inadequate creature, walking in the mist one early morning of that wet summer without summer of 1816. Quote, "This morning I had the idea to walk naked. Here I am in my inadequate skin, goose-fleshed and shivering, a poor specimen of a creature with no nose of a dog and no speed of a horse and no wings like the invisible buzzards whose cries I hear above me like lost souls, and no fins or even a mermaid's tail for this wrung-out weather. I am not as well found as that dormouse disappearing into a crack in the rock. I am a poor specimen of a creature, except that I can think," unquote. The enumeration of animal counterparts, each endowed with their specific gifts, highlights by contrast the nakedness and vulnerability of the human specimen, the way it did in the version of the myth to be found in Protagoras. Quote, "Prometheus came to inspect the distribution, and he found that the other animals were suitably furnished, but that man alone was naked and shoeless and had neither bed nor arms of defense," unquote. Through the reference to the myth, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Winterson's Frankissstein build themselves around an understanding of the human immediately embedded in our condition as technological beings. The ancient apprehension of arts and craftsmanship as compensation for an unacceptably limited condition still provides a crucial angle under which we apprehend our relationship with tech today. The machines we build both define the singularity of our condition and point to our resolve in overcoming the fragility inherent in that condition. Such a definition challenges any attempt at circumscribing an essence of the human outside of our ability to make tools and therefore intervene in our own evolution. This is what Bernard Stiegler reminds us through the concept of anthropogenesis, a continuous process of self-designing in which technics plays a fundamental role. Prometheus's brother appropriately plays the role of an antagonist in the essay Stiegler devoted to this phenomenon, La faute d'Epiméthée. With the advent of transhumanism, the question is, have we come to the point where the human condition finally runs its course and where humankind finally fuses with its machines and therefore brings a close to all those stories, all those myths? There is crucially one way in which Winterson's take on the description of the unprovided naked human body departs from what we were given in the myth. In the English translation of the Platonic text, the generic human creature, who was left to fend for themselves, was designated quite naturally as man. Though essenceless and exceptional in that sense, halfway between brute beasts and gods, the human was clearly endowed with some physical attributes, namely it was male. Another word for humanity was mankind, or simply man. What happens, therefore, in the substitution of Mary Shelley's naked body for that supposedly neutral masculine? In choosing Mary Shelley as her first-person narrator, Winterson deliberately brings her reader into the mind and body of a young woman and a young mother. And indeed, everywhere the paradoxical non-essence of humankind is brought up in the novel, female figures of desire and female figures of libido siendi show up, challenging the supposed neutrality of humankind as mankind. From Eve to Pandora, Mary Shelley and her absent mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, these women remind us that more is to be said about the human than the promise of finally overcoming the curse of our embodied condition. In that, they confirm the intuition formulated by Ray Shelley, himself a creature in between, for he's a trans man. Quote, "Young transhumanists believe that soon enough the human mind, our minds, will no longer be tied to a body that is a substrate made of meat. But for now, we are still human, all too human." Strange phrase that when you think about it. And 80% of internet traffic is pornography, unquote. In the enthusiastic, all-concerned contemplation of a human condition freed from the body, a critical mistake would be to assume that there are no other ways in which the category of the human still needs to be questioned and challenged. By revisiting the Promethean myth via mothers, real and fictional, Winterson proposes a critical exploration of ultra-contemporary ways of living with technology, an exploration that does not cross out altogether the category of the human as no longer relevant, but actually points to its limitations and still ambitions to extend it. Where Victor Stein's lecture considered the abolition of pesky binaries such as, male and female, all of that, he said, would be abolished in the glorious advent of the post-human future. But his audience were actually quick to poke holes in his brave new world, pointing out, as Rai did to us, that the world of tech and our post-human companions do not of themselves free us from the constraints of traditional, anthropocentric, and altogether quite questionable understandings and uses of the notion of humanity. In that sense, it feels quite significant that the sex bot industry should feature prominently in her novel, from the expo on robotics to the collaboration of Ron Lord, aka the sex bot king, with Victor Stein. So as a counterpoint to the dreams of transhumanism, the narrative explores the world of tech in a satirical tone and leaves out no cringeworthy detail. As an aside, I think there would be a lot to say about that choice of Winterson's, as opposed to the fact that in Ian McEwan's Machines Like Me, the gender bias behind that fact, the identification of the bot as sex bot, and more preferably as a hypersexualized female sex bot, or at least a bot that has a female voice and name, hello Alexa. That is merely mentioned and pushed aside on the first page in Ian McEwan's novel, and it's clearly right there at the center in Winterson's novel. So I'm expecting that we might have a discussion about that with Heike Miesler next week. What the non-male, non-cis protagonists of the novel warn us about is that our close commerce with tech or fusion with tech offers no easy way out through the supposed erasure of labels and boundaries. Virtuality in and of itself doesn't unmake the human in its most unpalatable, most destructive aspects. In fact, quite the opposite. And I think we'll find echoes of this in Black Mirror and Westworld later this afternoon. It takes a particular form of narrative, therefore, and a particular way of interacting with tech for the human to be challenged and displaced, actually and productively critiqued, rather than brought back to the center as the standard male, white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical figure that we all have come to know and love, all under the guise of post or transhumanism. if humanities and human sciences remain relevant at the dawn of Stein's Brave New World, it will be, for instance, because they will propose a feminist or genderqueer critique of the category of the human through the retelling of the story. Hence, our choice of title for this first webinar series, which connects the necessity of the extended body, our technological selves, with a classic text of feminism's challenge to the standard of human as man. Like Frankissstein, the Feminist Manifesto, Our Bodies, Ourselves, pointed to the correlation of the body and the self, not to leave the body behind as a cumbersome reminder of women's mistreatment at the hands of the patriarchy, but to claim the body, reclaim the body as an interface for other practices than those dictated by liberal humanist thinking. Just as Winterson's narrative doesn't believe in doing away with the human body, it warns us against readily adopting the post-human perspective with the illusion that it would dispense us from critically reassessing the human as a category. Therefore, it seems, the work of the humanities or human science scholar is still cut out for them. So let's see what the novel still considers as our task in this. One indication should have warned us that there was something off in Victor Stein's enviably smooth use of visual aids. What the animation presents us with, for all intents and purposes, is the disappearance of man by drowning. In a context where we readers are made to empathize with Mary Shelley, who we know is bound to lose her husband that way, the lecturer's smile would probably feel a little bit too glib. And indeed, the description of Shelley's drowned body, some 200 pages later, contrasts starkly with the dispassionate, seemingly peaceful representation of humanity's erasure. Recurringly in the novel, a female and/or feminist viewpoint challenges what might appear like a bit of an easy assumption that humanity's imperfection warrants, or could be solved by, something as simple as just its extinction, or the way Victor Stein would put it, quote, accelerated evolution, unquote. This warning against romanticizing the notion of just doing away with the human altogether, this warning is first formulated quite appropriately in a discussion that pits young Mary Shelley against Lord Byron and Dr. Polidori. At the start of the conversation, the man of science and the poet each voice their disgust at the human race and dream of a clean slate. Quote, "Why is it that we wish to leave some mark behind?" said Byron. "Is it only vanity?" "No," I said, "it is hope. Hope that one day there will be a human society that is just." "That will never happen," said Polidori, "not unless every human being is wiped away and we begin again," unquote. So while Mary defends the social, political, and critical ambition for humanity that she inherited from her deceased mother, Polidori and Byron much more readily despair of humanity's ability to strive for more justice. Later on, this exchange presents with another romantic notion of humankind's dance with death. Quote, "Do you believe that if every person had enough money, enough work, enough leisure, enough learning, that if they were not oppressed by those above them or fearful of those below them, humankind would be perfected?" Byron asked this in his negative drawl, sure of the response, and so I set out to disaffect him. "I do," I said. "I do not," said Byron. "The human race seeks its own death. We hasten towards what we fear most," unquote. In rejecting Byron's assessment of the human condition, Mary forgoes the seductive grandeur of the proverbial formulation, the human race seeks its own death. She forgoes that temptation of the proverbial formulation, the tragic tone, and she counters with a painfully specific evocation of death as an empirical fact. I said, "It is men who seek death. If a single one of you carried a life in his womb for 9 months, only to see that child perish as a baby, or in infancy, or through want, disease, or thereafter war, you would not seek death in the way that you do." "Yet death is heroic," said Byron, "and life is not," unquote. Mary Shelley's resistance to Byron's logic, which glamorizes death and thereby unmakes anthropocentrism slightly too easily, that resistance comes as a warning to us. Should we be tempted to forget about the brutality of what the human condition still means for so many members of our species. Mary Shelley's attachment to critiquing human bodies in the hope of a more just state of affairs is meant to counter Byron's and Polidori's oblivious disdain for what many are still deprived of. It should remind us to be cautious in our critical apprehension of the category of the human, that if we were less privileged than we are, for instance, if our own human rights were brought into question, then we would object far less about using the adjective and claiming it for ourselves. So Mary exposes her interlocutor's privilege and calls for humility in the face of suffering, the sort of suffering that another might feel in their flesh and that we might thankfully never have to experience. In order to do so, she draws on her own experience as a bereaved mother. Shelley lost multiple children, a fact which Winterson does not push aside to focus on her role as, an author and an intellectual, quite the opposite. Such a warning against the blasé posturing adopted by Byron and Polidori ties in with the more vehement reproach hurled at Stein earlier, what is so smart about the end of the human? But it significantly also ties in with the work of a crucial practitioner of feminism and de-anthrocentric thinking, Donna Haraway. In her writings on making kin, and staying with the trouble, Haraway voices her misgivings with regards to the category of the post-human. In its assumption of something done, of a completed process, the prefix post might seem to allow for the kind of rather easy posturing that we see in Winterson's Byron. Crucially, Haraway reminds us, quote, "We are all compost, not post-human." As academics living and working in highly privileged circumstances, we should remember that, quote, "The edge of extinction is not just a metaphor. System collapse is not a thriller. Ask any refugee of any species." A further element connects Mary Shelley's and Donna Haraway's warning that we might be too quick to celebrate the end of the human and downplaying or overlooking the reality of death itself. In critiquing Byron's blasé posture and his failure to register the privilege that actually placed him squarely in what the human as man might entail, Mary positions herself as a mother against the authority of the poet as a father. So while Byron addresses her as he would a child and voices disappointment at siring a daughter, without realizing that she will actually grow to be a most prominent mathematical mind, Mary counters from her own sense of what it is to bring children into the world. To her, the experience of parenthood doesn't come with potency or a sense of absolute power at the sight of absolute vulnerability, quite the contrary. To Mary, motherhood is about putting her own life on the line to have children whom she won't be able to preserve from death. And I quote her again here. "Oh, I'm used to death and I hate it. There is no new life without death. There can be no death unless there is life." The refusal to surrender in the discussion with Byron therefore constitutes a challenge to patrilinear authority and detachment. What Mary Shelley's feminist stance effectively proposes there is another approach to genealogy. Transitioning from Frankenstein to Frankissstein, we've indeed gone from fatherhood and patrilinearity to mothers and an altogether more complex approach to filiation. In the original novel, the notion of creation and procreation clearly hinged on a patriarchal model of thought. This was, for instance, what Shelley's choice of epigraph suggested, namely a quote from Milton's Paradise Lost, in which Adam addresses his creator. "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me man," etc. This patriarchal bent was also what early film adaptations picked up on. So for instance, in the 1931 version with Boris Karloff, all's well that ends well at the end, the creature's dead, and the film actually ends with Frankenstein's father raising a glass to the promise of, quote, "an heir to the house of Frankenstein." So, we've got the patriarch celebrating his son his son's coming back into the fold and giving up on his crazy schemes, and having a male heir for the House of Frankenstein. In Winterson's rereading, genealogy is no longer about ancestry in the patriarchal sense. Rather, it has undergone a queering process that challenges its normal authority. Significantly, however, that transition towards mothers and adoptive mothers does not propose as a corrective to male hubris and patrilinear creation a more quote-unquote natural form of creation as biologically embedded in femininity and motherhood. If anything, Mary Shelley's relationship with the mother who died giving birth to her, and the intellectual bond that she shares with her through her writings, this should be an indication that the genealogical model under consideration in Frankissstein is troubled, is complex, and made of a mix of the organic and the non-organic. Mary Wollstonecraft is mainly present in the novel as an essay and a tombstone. The idea, therefore, is not to forego filiation altogether, to choose the clean slate of non-biological reproduction, but to find the trouble within organic filiation and an alternative to patriarchal narratives of transmission. This is represented, for instance, by a depiction of fatherhood that stands poles apart from Byron's version of it. Of her own husband, Mary Shelley tells us, quote, "When I was pregnant with William, he used to get on his knees as I sat on the edge of the bed and hold my stomach in his hands like a rare book he hadn't read. 'This is the world in little,' he said. And that morning, oh, I remember it, we sat in the sun together and I felt my baby kick for joy." The comparison of the child to a book yet to be read acknowledges Percy Shelley's readiness to welcome a life that he cannot in any way predetermine or dictate a direction for. So instead of the author/progenitor, he is a reader on the cusp of opening the book and welcoming a configuration of words that will not be his to change. What the comparison tells us, as humanities scholars, significantly, is that like having children, telling stories is an activity that pertains to genealogy. In that sense, the strange, non-patriarchal, non-linear form of genealogy that the novel points to also works as a possible roadmap for us. For if children might or might not be part of our lives as academics, telling stories is certainly part of our practice. The connection between the making of children and the writing of stories is made most evident in the novel by Mary Shelley's role as a mother and an author. In conversations with Shelley, Mary is made to consider her own responsibility with regards to the story she's bringing into the world. While Frankenstein won't name his creature, she will give a name to her own brainchild, however monstrous. Quote, "What father does not name his child?" asked Shelley. "One who's terrified of what he has created," I said. "Well then, Mary, it is for you to decide. You are father and mother to this tale. What will you name your creation?" Like parents, the creators of narratives contribute to shaping the genealogy of our times by begetting creatures, whether human or non-human, real or fictional, so begetting creatures that will take on a life of their own. The creators of narratives also contribute to shaping genealogy by naming those creatures. And finally, they contribute to shaping genealogy by reaching out into the past and future, and therefore connecting, organizing time. So I'll run through these three aspects very quickly. Putting a name on things is as big a responsibility as naming a child. That's what we hear in response to Mary Shelley's decision to name her character. 2 centuries later, a contemporary time-traveling version of that same paper creature, one will recognize under the name Victor Stein, warns his audience that, quote, "To name things wrongly is to add to the misfortune of the world. Naming is still our primary task. Poets and philosophers know this. Calling things by their right names is more than giving them an identity bracelet or a label or a serial number. We summon a vision. Naming is power," unquote. This reminder, which surfaces in the lecture just as Dr. Stein, quote, "heads out of the sciences and into the arts," unquote. This reminder is clearly meant for anyone who might devote their work to the analysis and better understanding of all things human. right at the point where the contours of what we call humans seem to be shifting. And this notion of a shift in time points to the last aspect through which storytelling and genealogy making connect. By begetting narratives and or children, we reach out into the past and into the future, and we try to order time into something readable. The way in which we order the past has a name: history. And for some time already, conceiving of alternative forms of genealogy has been identified within the humanities as one good way to use and tell and retell and reread history. In Foucault's proposal for genealogical thinking, and in the later work of philosophers such as François Noodleman, the close examination of the historical conditions that begot frames of thought and shaped certain events, this close examination allows for a critical reappraisal of those forces that framed human understanding and actions at various points in time. In Frankissstein, this constant reworking of the past and the shape we've given it so far is formulated thus when considering the role of society, quote, "The timeless serenity of the past that we British do so well is an implanted memory. You could call it a fake memory. What seems so solid and certain is really part of the ceaseless pull it down, build it again pattern of history, where the turbulence of the past is recast as landmark, as icon, as tradition, as what we defend, what we uphold, until it's time to call in the wrecking ball. In any case, the Royal Society only moved here in 1967. History is what you make it." On the other end of that no longer chronological line, so steering towards the future, this genealogy of a new kind, non-patrilinear genealogy, might stop trying to determine the outcome of those stories in the making. In that sense, what the novel might call us to exercise is the sort of cautious parenting that truly will allow for the kind of surprise Percy Shelley anticipates holding his unborn son like an unread book. As Victor Stein puts it to Rye, in all of the debate, the newspaper articles, the TV channels, schlock drama, the scaremongering, the rapturous geek rallies, the sober Chinese scientists, we see it all from our own human point of view, like a set of selfish parents planning the future for their children, and with no sense of how those children might develop independently, unquote. Maybe, in the face of our uncertain future as human beings, and until machines start telling their own stories, the most unselfish, most responsible thing for the humanities to do is to make room in our narratives for that moment when our brain children might grow to emancipate themselves and surprise us. That way, we might be ready one day to acknowledge and connect with something or someone outside our necessarily limited human selves. That said, I'll shut up now and gratefully pass on the mic to my co-host Sarah so she can introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was wonderful. We're now gonna listen to Renaud Evrard. Thank you so much for joining us. Renaud is a clinical psychologist, associate professor of psychology at the University of Lorraine in Nancy. He's leading the team clinical and projective psychopathology at the laboratory Interspy. He worked in an adolescent ambulatory setting in the psychotherapeutic center of Nancy. So, Renaud, whenever you want.
Hello, thank you. I think you can hear me and see my keynote. That's yes. Okay? Okay, yeah. So for this talk, I'm going to move from fiction to reality and back. And ultimately, you can choose which world you prefer to live in. I will begin with a nosedive, the first episode of the third series of the British science fiction anthology series Black Mirror. This dystopia depicts how social media can influence our behavior. It first appeared online in 2016, and the episode is set in a world where society has embraced the technology wherein everyone shares their daily activity through implants and mobile device and rates their interaction with others on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. cumulatively affecting everyone's socioeconomic status. Many critics note the similarity of the episode to real-world app People, in which users could rate one another on China's upcoming social credit system, a governmental initiative planned for national application in 2020, what is now. I will first focus on this social credit system, on which it's very hard to gather clear information. What I found through many online articles and documentaries is that this system means to enhance awareness to integrity and credibility within society. And it was tested in many Chinese areas since 2014 and has now become generalized. And every pilot area apply its own rules, but there are some common rules. The first rule is that every citizen begins with the same maximum starting score, and then they can lose or win points. These credibility scores measure 5 aspects of the individual citizen: their financial credit history, their ability to fulfill their contractual obligation, their personal information, their behavior and preferences, like shopping, internet, etc., their interpersonal relationship, including their political opinions. And furthermore, a person's score is dependent on the scores of the people in their social circle. For instance, in the case of residents under the age of 14 who violate traffic rules, their legal guardians will need to take educational courses or to do hours of community service. Otherwise, the traffic violation will be recorded in their own credit profile. The data is mainly collected through automatic digital systems like the 400 million smart closed-circuit television cameras deployed in all China. That's 42% of all surveillance cameras in the world, and also by local authorities. For instance, if you did a good deed, you need to collect evidence of it with your smartphone, and the beneficiary should also send a picture or video to the authorities. Some people are professional assessors of these good or bad deeds. The Chinese social credit system extends from finance to almost all areas of social life. Plus, the Chinese system intends to include not only individuals, but also businesses, government branches, and non-governmental organizations. The social credit system already applies to foreign workers and companies in China, and possibly also to all overseas Chinese and ethnically Chinese people, regardless of their place of residence. The official document points out that rewards and penalties are the keys to making the social credit system work. However, the text regarding rewards and penalties is very vague and brief. Examples for the pilot areas show that the most successful system is the one focusing on rewarding action more than on the punishing ones. However, we can list a lot of penalties which have been already applied to millions of Chinese citizens, like paying a fine, going to a re-education camp, suffering humiliation through media reportings or forms of public shaming, like publicly listing jaywalkers caused by facial recognition camera in Shenzhen. The government launched a mobile app to geolocalize the outcasts close to you and have their detailed profile. Their smartphone have a false alarm bell, and those who call them are warned that they should urge this person to fulfill their obligation. Being put on a China-wide blacklist, this can concern public transport, visa, financial opportunity, market withdrawal mechanisms, house renting, access to school or university, access to hospital or other government service, membership to the single political party, access to professions like teacher, trader, journalist, doctor, politician. We have examples of more personal limitation of opportunities. People have have had their internet connection slowed down, have been banned from buying a pet or from registering on dating websites. The specifically mentioned rewards include praise through media reporting, priority status in different contexts, and expedited processing for government service. The system has already allowed some people with high scores to rent vehicles without a deposit or to pay to skip hospital queues. All in all, this score will then be absolutely determinant for their lives. Propaganda campaigns say that the score is your second identity card and your passport to society. What appeared with this system is that all social inegalities are now legalized. One important aspect is that the whole system is shaped through gamification, like what Botsman said. Platform building tools inspired by the mechanisms developed and perfect with the computer game sector for other purposes to incentivize good behavior and drive active participation and engagement over a long period. This generates a massive amount of peer pressure, and people with a high score have said they are happy with the system, but they deserve a score and find everything fair. Any rule may become a social law that homogeneously affects individuals' fates. For instance, in the Queensland area, erotic films and books were banned. It is forbidden to grow vegetables on the streets, to be rude to your neighbor, or to parade about in a luxury car at weddings or funerals. You could lose points for a variety of infringements, such as traffic light violation, drunk driving, or having a child without the necessary administrative permission. Evil is calculated, a score to root them all and in the darkness bind them. Charlie Brooker, the creator of the series Black Mirror, has commented on numerous occasions about links between the episode, Nosedive, and the social credit system. He comments that a key difference between China's rating system and the one in Nosedive is that whereas the central government assessing things being state control, it feels ever more sinister. And he also points out that the social credit system sounds like an attempt to make the population behave in a particular way. As a governmental program, is it really worse than as a non-governmental initiative? It cannot be assumed that what happens in China stays in China. Max Siddiq and Matthias Sims recently published a paper that suggests this system may become a model for other countries. They seek to provide a critical but also nuanced and measured assessment against a backdrop of typical Western responses which simply dismiss the social credit system as Orwellian. But they show in their paper that we already have a very corrosive Orwellian system in the West. And in fact, Chinese intellectuals were inspired by the American system in designing financial credits and insurance. In his book on democracy in America, Tocqueville had already glimpsed this problem when he wrote that democracy risks becoming a system of standardization and oppression of individuals that will leave behind all the authoritarian powers of the past. The sociologist Bertrand Meus described this oxymoron of a standardized individual, an enhanced but transparent and interchangeable human being, a simple connection platform on which to install the technological application that will connect it with the universe. And Kokaz and Alisa, more recently, described how this process is already generalized in our society. In fact, plenty of reputation-based quantitative tools have already become established in the West. So the social credit system may tell us something about the future evolution in Western countries. The success of eBay and real estate sites has long been attributed in part to the way in which a platform has become trusted by users on how well understood information asymmetries are handled and countered. Trust in a sales platform is said to be a combination of payment security, reliable and affordable channels for dispute resolution, and of particular and present interest, trust-building measures like the mutual rating system, which allow for online reputation. How many systems do we know and use in which buyers and sellers rate each other with commands published for all to see? So actually, we already have a social credit system with the assessment of all by all. It's difficult to know which is worse between the explicitly authoritative and paternalistic power of a government against all and the implicit power of all against all. Present-day observers know that online trust encompasses digital social capital and various means of certifying and validating market participants. Consequently, all major economy platforms such as Uber, Airbnb, and TaskRabbit, and indeed precursors such as Couchsurfing, make use of a combination of scoring and feedback system. A frequent reaction is that the Chinese social credit system is incompatible with Western political and cultural value. For example, it has been suggested that it may be suitable for an authoritarian political system, but not in a liberal democracy. But in fact, we just implicitly apply the social credit system daily. China is shifting to becoming a reputation state, but we are fully in a reputation society. Marxistic ancients highlight difference between both systems. The most obvious one is that the social credit system is not based on subjective ratings by other citizens. Indeed, it may be said that this subjectivity is closer to the contemporary Western ratings, such as Uber or Airbnb, than the more objective and more algorithmic emerging Chinese one. The second difference is that ratings initiated by the state or companies may be designed in a way that they provide targeted incentive, not simply being nice as in the Black Mirror episode, which does not specify how the system came about or who controls it. It may also be an advantage that interventionists or centrally plain rating system can be more easily be shaped and controlled by law and regulation. At present in Western countries, public authorities are more likely to engage with rating and reputation system through acquiescence or encouragement, and only sometimes through regulation, which may be very indirect. This means that we are the unconscious accomplice of this unequal system. And if we enjoy a certain pleasure when it comes to watching, punishing, and rewarding others, we suffer as the truth of being assessed in the same way ourselves is very hard to think. And yet, this is obviously what happens continuously. Besides being an assistant professor in psychology, I'm a clinical psychologist. I used to work in adult psychiatry, but since 2018, I asked to work in an adolescent ambulatory practice in psychiatry unit. So adolescents hold the society of the future in store. One case that fascinated me was a girl of 17 years old sent to us by her mother because she had trouble at school. She couldn't focus. The mother suspected a form of autism, which sounds a bit too fashionable to be right. As soon as the mother left the room, the girl started to bring out a lot of issues with men, women, and sexuality. She had a boyfriend for 2 years, but that was quite complicated. They used Snapchat daily to share nude pictures. It was far from easy for this patient to share because she was very bashful. She lived at boarding school during the week and could not undress in front of other girls. But ephemeral nudes that vanished after a few minutes were okay. However, when she came into contact with her boyfriend, who lived in the same school, they barely kiss each other. They didn't touch each other and barely spoke. It took me several sessions to understand that she was a virgin and that it did not take the recently offered opportunity to make love to her. They had arguments because she demanded a lot of attention and became jealous of his proximity with other girls. But it was impossible for her to have a couple conversation, to communicate all this to him. They just sent news and consider it as a form of romantic relationship. We see in this case how the smartphone technology adapts to the psychical resistance of puberty, allowing for sexuality without a body or with these extended bodies. This girl had already had a similar kind of distant relationship 3 years before when she was fighting against anorexic tendency. She used to write long emails or forum messages under pseudonym to a woman she knew was already of majority age. It was a relationship in which the woman had a lot of power over her, which generated a lot of suffering, but which emancipated my patient from the bond with a thoroughly suffocating mother. Thanks to the internet, she did not have to position herself with her real body. Thus, she could invest everything in the intellectual zone like so many other anorexics. Even if she was transparent, entirely made in a virtual avatar. She did not even need to choose a sexual orientation or identity, since we can love both sexes or be both in this configuration. During the therapy, the patient gained a lot of insight into her own behavior and its inscription within the family context. She began to master her emotion and improve her communication skills. And she translated that into her use of connection tools, as she told me one day that she stopped the flames. She explained to me that in a romantic relationship, but also with some close friends, she was constrained by a 24-hour hourglass. Within that time frame, she had to send a snap, which fed a fire symbolizing the continuity of the relationship. Then the other must reciprocally do the same. One day, she saw the hourglass ready to empty, but chose to turn a smartphone off. We could read this as a more romantic epilogue in a contemporary teenager's love story, but the true end of the therapy came after her. She told me that she invited the best-looking girl in the entire school to her mother's house and had sex with her. There, I agreed that way it was over. I have plenty of other cases implying new technology with issues such as digital bullying, among others, but a telling anecdote might be I had to fire my intern, as she was unable to stop constantly looking at her smartphone to check if her academics results had been posted online. This concern around assessment traps more and more people. And my intern, which is also my student now, is now on a logout schedule to cut her screen time to half an hour a day, which I would be incapable of doing myself. According to psychoanalytic theory, it could be also said that it is just a normal feature of human society that we depend on the subjective judgment of others, regardless of whether this is quantified or not. Freud calls that secondary narcissism. We invest love in objects, that is to say over people or activity, and then we collect some reward that we use to love ourselves through primary narcissism. But we are in a configuration where the current shape of this secondary narcissism prevents the normal process of primary narcissism. This is because our Orwellian Big Brother system is based on an utopia of absolute transparency of the real. In other words, what is not seen doesn't exist. All of society is bound up in this ideology. We use economic liberalism as an ideal of freedom, science as an ideal for truth, and worldwide generalized communication as an ideal of social connection. Thus, there is a need to exhibit ourselves in this transparency. Not only is everything worth showing, but you have to show it. The disconnected individual is immediately suspect. The social credit system is not a choice. Someone who wants to stay in the implicit, the unsafe, the repressed is a threat to others. Logically, people try to exist by going viral, or as we say in the sort of French invented especially for the globally-speaking world of the internet, faire le buzz. Everyone is in search of virality, of being appreciated by more and more strangers. We have to expand our online social capital. No one wants to post a picture that receives no likes. There is a break within the circuit that usually feeds primary narcissism. We don't love ourselves as such if others do not show us the way. Our libido is fundamentally oriented towards others in order to guarantee inner peace. Therefore, the best position we can expect is conformism. Virtually, we have to be what people most like. This is evident in the use of social networks by teenagers, but we adults are responsible for filling them with these ideals of excessive perfection. Sometimes it becomes clear that this secondary narcissism is a total mess because we can't capitalize on it. All it takes is an humiliation, a photo clumsily or clearly shared in public mode, and our reputation fades to naught and takes away our esteem. And even if our reputation is fine today, we have to maintain it again and again permanently without being able truly to capitalize by returning to oneself our love for the objects. It is the social being lost in the abyss of a labyrinth of mirrors returning into infinity, and more distantly an image of himself that multi-duplication have slowly made unidentifiable, said Thierry Vincent about anorexic people. There is no psychopathology of the virtual, said Missonnier, based on this alienation in the eyes of others, where narcissistic and object investment are out of kilter. Transparency, virality, and conformism unite in the figure of the imposter, which Roland Gori took as the main feature of contemporary society. We use our authenticity as a tool to be loved by others, sharing more and more extimacy within the public space. Some authors say that the virtual profile has now become the equivalent of an erogenous zone that each individual stimulates in his own way. The connectivity allowed through social networks is paradoxically the main source of conflictuality and therefore of hypocrisy. We are able to configure our interaction, which allow us to block the inappropriate other, to meet only between people with exclusive affinity, and to remain within a narcissism of small differences. We miss all the structuring effects of conflicts. Social networks value the bespoke otherness as flattering as possible, where everyone's like the photo on the page of the other as a modality of universal narcissistic tranquility by imposture. We have an unconscious alliance that keeps our society as one by means of a negative pact. We all know real life is not on Facebook or Instagram, but the likes work like highly addictive daily fixes. Conclusion, in the nosedive episode, the social decline of the main character allow her to reconnect with her true emotion, to access new transgression, and to see a different distribution of good and evil. Should we then become anarchists, stop reading and replying to all emails, and refuse to rate services or consider ratings? We currently live in a society where we believe that this network, emails and ratings are parts of normal life and are based on genuine needs and opinion. I understand that my thought reflects our humanity in a rather black mirror, but perhaps my pessimistic pessimistic tone is the only way to avoid this nosedive. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Renaud, for this really interesting presentation. We'll come back to it later with questions. But first, we're going to listen to Bettina's paper, and I'm going to give her a quick introduction before listening to her. So Bettina is a doctoral student at Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich, and she's currently associated with the international doctoral program Mimesis, Munich doctoral so the Munich doctoral program for literature and the arts at LMU Munich. And her PhD project, supervised by Professor Tobias Düring, focuses on the discourse on humanity in the context of artificial versions of human self-mimesis in art. And she has a special interest in artificial humanity and posthumanism. And her PhD title has changed, so I will let her give it to us. And yeah, I'll give her the floor now. Thank you, Bettina.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Even if I may, thank you also everybody who organized this. I do think it takes a lot out of all of us to keep science alive in this very challenging year. So thanks again. I think I go right into it, and I'll start with at a place that is maybe a bit unexpected, and that is Theodor Adorno's posthumously published Aesthetic Theory, which contains a somewhat curious accusation against art. In it, he writes, "Art's own gesture is cruel. In aesthetic forms, cruelty becomes imagination. Something is excised from the living, from the body of language, from tones, from visual experience. The purer the form and the higher the autonomy of works, the more cruel they are." This view of art as inherently violent means thinking of art not as a purely mimetic process, but a formation and deformation of existing material. Adorno later refers to the choosing and cutting and foregoing of things. This means that art exercises power over material. It dominates, it forms, and it deforms it, which implies a power dynamic between creator and creation in art. And Adorno calls this violence the original sin in art. And while this original sin for Adorno is of course figurative, the depiction of violence in art is actually a ubiquitous phenomenon, which readily ties into his theoretical musics. Violence has been the method and indeed the subject matter of art since its very beginnings. And humanity's fascination with it is all the more obvious when it comes to the artificial human figure, the android. Just a few examples that you might recognize here. Androids have traditionally been utilized as a projection surface for reflections of humanity through art. The artificial human in art is part of a complex mimetic model that allows us to question ourselves, our nature, our purpose, the boundaries of our identity through the figure. So engaging with the artistic figure of the android is engaging with the intricate dynamics between humanity and its own self-portrait. The question then is, why do we so persistently violate these bodies if they are meant to represent and reflect ourselves? The corporeal aspects of our identity as human is among the themes of android art. They are figures that function as humans, but are not constrained by the same ontological boundaries. Consequently, their bodies are often employed for discussions on corporeal humanity and testing the limits of that concept. Physical violence is a common tool for this. Infringing on an android's bodies allows us to test our capacity for empathy and identification with artificial bodies, and thus explore the boundaries of our own corporeal identity. Which brings us to the example that I've chosen for this, which is Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy's 2016 TV series Westworld. Without getting too far into the plot here, Westworld is a Wild West theme park populated by androids who are entertaining human guests. It contains extensive and very explicit explorations of fictional violence against artificial human bodies, as it subjects its host, the androids, to progressively escalating physical abuse by humans. That ranges from casual beatings and shootings to deliberate mutilations and sexual assault. It explores the whole range of human violence, and it does so through the not quite human bodies of the hosts, utilizing the safe spaces of art and of artificial humans. And in my opinion, the usage of these safe spaces is what allows us to categorize this series as this sort of highbrow philosophical sci-fi that we usually do, instead of what would otherwise be, which is pure shock value entertainment. In a complex interplay of conceptual illusions, Westworld poses questions on how artificiality affects the cathartic effect of art, how it impacts identification processes, and how human artificial humans are in the eye of the beholder and for the purposes of art. It utilizes the recipient's discontent with watching physical violence towards what registers emotionally as their fellow human, regardless of whether they are artificial or not, or for that matter, fictitious or real. Therefore, watching Westworld is really an exercise in identity. Human corporeal identity is explored through the violation of humanoid artificial bodies, with two effects. Within the narrative, the characters' reactions to the violence, and on a meta level, the recipient's reaction mirroring theirs. Our actual human proclivity for violence as a form of entertainment is simultaneously highlighted and questioned. Are we, the viewer, not enjoying what we see in the same way the guests are gaining enjoyment from the torments of the hosts? And in the following scene that I've brought, I'd like to make an example for how Westworld utilizes these established dynamics and deconstructs them. And now let's all pray that it actually works.
And as much as I would love to let you just throw it all away, I can't. Do you think you're the first sap to fall for one of these things? She's not like the others. She's what? Special? Well, it's only right that you share then, isn't it? Come here. Prove to me that you're a real live girl. Me. Oh, darling, I am just getting started. Don't touch her! I share the blame. I push too hard. You have a poetic soul, Billy, but it is time for a fucking wake-up call. Hold her. Perhaps a more visceral demonstration. God damn you! Look, Billy. Look. You have to look!
Right. So the infringement on the android's body serves to expose her artificiality. The perpetrator seeks to affirm her non-humanity. The violent transgression of her bodily boundaries serves to demonstrate her non-humanity. Beneath the literal boundary of her skin, mechanical inner workings are exposed and the artificial core is revealed. However, the violation supposed to dehumanize her has only limited effect because the victimization of the android and violation of her body creates sympathy, both with characters and the viewer. Through dehumanizing violence, she actually is humanized, a process that capitalizes on corporeal identification and a gendered victim-perpetrator dynamic. Corporeal identity is a tangible, immediate, and therefore very potent part of human identity. As a constant in human history, it allows for instinctive classification of fellow humans. If your body is human, then you are human, and therefore we are human. This corporeal identity transcends the body's mutation, mutilation, and even death. And it is, under certain circumstances, extendable towards non-human objects, if the non-human is anthropomorphic enough, which is certainly true for artificial humans. Arguably, therefore, infringing on the corporeal boundaries of artificial humans is analogous to a transgression of a human body, because the instinctive and immediate reaction to the violation shows us identifying with the violated humanoid body, artificial or not. Considering artificial human bodies in fiction evoke our empathy and are at least partly able to participate in the group dynamics of the human identity, what are the implications for real-life technology? The simple truth is that artificial humanity is a rapidly evolving technological field with various applications, be it via neural networks or actual artificial bodies. The automation through these human-like technologies is happening and will continue to happen in the future. The question is, considering our emotional connection to them, should android bodies be awarded certain rights? Westworld's hyperbolic, yet not entirely improbable vision demonstrates the need for a public and scientific discussion on robot ethics. The due propriety in our interactions with humanoids but not human bodies is a controversial topic. The question whether violent behaviors through and by robots should be regulated is, however, gaining public attention and calls for action. I'm sorry. Seem to have slight problems here. Just a second, I'm sorry.
It also works if you can't put it on the full screen.
That's not the problem, I'm afraid.
Bettina, do you want to try closing the PowerPoint presentation and then opening it again? Or just wait.
Just one last time. Let me try. Ah, there we go. Ah, I'm sorry about that. Okay.
No worries.
Okay, so calls for action have been made, for example, by the Robotic and Automation Society and the campaign to stop killer robots, aptly named, in my opinion. Okay, beyond that, MIT's Kate Darling has been publishing on the problem since 2012. And her article, Extending Legal Protection to Social Robot, confirms the emotional potential of android technology. I quote, Social robots play off this tendency by mimicking cues that we automatically associate with certain states of mind or feelings. Even in today's primitive form, this can elicit emotional reactions from people that are similar, for instance, to how we react to animals and to each other. From being reluctant to switch off robots that give the appearance of animacy to ascribing mental states to robotic pets, we respond to the cues given to us by lifelike machines, even if we know that they are not real. Darling cites animal protection laws to argue what society protects is not determined by the inherent qualities of a thing or, for that matter, consistent morality. We ascribe different rights to different animals based on popular sentiment, and when it comes to non-humans, humanity has a clear tendency to protect that which it can relate to. Anthropomorphism plays a major role in this relational process because it facilitates the emotional projection. This theoretical concept is observable in real life. For example, the relationship between humans and autonomous robots in the military. Darling cites a 2007 US Army colonel who reportedly couldn't bear to continue an exercise with a robot that defuses landmines by stepping on them, and therefore aborted the exercise. The Washington Post writes, the colonel could just not stand the pathos of watching the burned, scarred and crippled machine drag itself forward on its last leg. The test he charged was inhumane. The choice of words is here, of course, interesting. Now, looking at androids, who more so than landmine robots are mimetically built for maximum relation and emotional projection, it would seem logical to extend some form of protection to them simply because violent behavior towards something we cannot reliably emotionally separate from ourselves is concerning and might warrant punitive regulation. And indeed, we are actually at the moment seeing the first regulatory attempts. There has been a recent proposal in Germany to criminalize the production and purchase of sex dolls with childlike designs. That is a development I would actually be very interested in hearing your opinions on during the discussion. But in conclusion of this brief introduction into the discourse at hand, I'd like to reiterate that discussing artificial human figures in art is almost inevitably involving seeing and discussing violence onto the artificial human body. We infringe on their boundaries in an attempt to discover ours. Art has extensively experimented with these dynamics and shows the empathetic connection between the android body and our own. Our artistic associations with the topic have enormous influence on discourse on real technology, and because of that, it will be interesting to see the impact the mostly dystopian visions art has given us will have and what lessons we will choose to learn from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bettina. That was fascinating. I'm just going to remind you that if you have questions, you can ask them in the chat box, the conversation chat box. And you can also just raise your hands, use the emoji and speak. I have a couple of questions already. Maybe I'm going to start with a question for Renaud, because I think many people have questions for you, because we all know children or adolescents who are addicted to social media or video games, or to screens more generally. So Renaud, so it's someone else's question. Does the Black Mirror of the evaluation of all by all means that would, I didn't, sorry, I'm going to rephrase. Does the Black Mirror of the evaluation of all by all mean that the only way out would be something like a tech cleanse, so a kind of tech detox? This is what you suggested in your story, and it's also suggested by the end of the Black Mirror episode that you mentioned. I have a second question for you. As a therapist, is there a specific form of training you can take to address the sorts of pathologies associated with the use and overuse of tech? So first question, do you recommend tech cleanses, and is there a specific form of training that you can take?
Thank you for both questions. I'm not a specialist of what we have to do in these cases, but my impression is that we cannot clean everything because it's part of social daily exchange. But there's a part of education about what are our use of media, and I'm more thinking that maybe we have to use them. My way to deal with this topic is to become interested in Snapchat, in other tools that the new teenagers are using, and to try to integrate them in the therapeutic session. So if we can play video games or discuss everything about their interest on every kind of, I don't know, or they are playing or they are discussing with other. So there are plenty of ways to integrate the technology inside the setting to make this a material that we can use, not only with the difference in generation, the generation gap, so, but mainly use them. So mostly like that, I prefer.
Thank you. So, wait, can you hear me? Yeah. So, yes, one can detach oneself from these technologies without necessarily cutting them off totally. I mean,
yes.
So. Mm-hmm. Great. Bettina, do you want to ask a question? Or am I?
It's just a short comment. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. What I particularly liked was you pointing out that opposed to the Chinese social credit system that we all know and like to criticize very publicly, we do have established similar systems in place in the West. And a thought that I had was what is so curious about these systems is that almost immediately after they started, we have found ways to artificially undermine them, right? Because votes and bots and even Google searches and follows on social platforms can be bought. And I always thought that it was curious that this supposedly very personal merit system has been immediately artificialized.
So there is a question for me or general comment?
It was just meant as a comment, but if you thoughts on it, I'd like to hear them, of course.
Yeah, both are everywhere.
I think it's a fascinating remark, and I never thought about that before. I have nothing more to say, but I never thought about that. So, thank you. The question part is always the trickiest in these Zoom meetings. But, I'm gonna wait a couple more minutes.
I think Estelle has a question for Bettina, actually.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. So Bettina, you were asking us what we think about what the German government wants to do, you know, in terms of legislating around robots that have childlike features. But have you looked into it, and what do you think? Where does your research leave you, or is it too personal a question? What do you think?
And I have researched this as part of the PhD project, obviously, and I've managed to talk with industry people, and of course they are biased, but the argument is, and I do find that I do find that somewhat convincing, that there is a massive lack of research for this. We simply do not know whether contact with these like dolls helps people with that confliction, or whether it makes everything worse. We just don't know, and the willingness to finance that sort of research just isn't there. The facts are that at least in Germany, there are about 1.2 million therapy places too few for the people that we have that deal with that confliction, and they don't have any means to search for help at all. And the industry argues that they at least are offering something. That is a biased answer to the problem, I'm aware, but they do have a point when it comes to the research, I'd say. What is the argument for the legislation is that in Germany, it is part of a larger attempt to punish sex crimes against minors more harshly, which I wouldn't be opposed to, like, of course, but I do think seeing that the research just isn't there, it is a bit, it might be a bit of a PR move, to be honest.
And just one last question, sorry. Do you know if other countries have already legislating around this, or is it just a grey area everywhere?
It's a huge grey area. I mean, the whole sex doll industry is full of grey areas, because there are, for example, cases of people ordering dolls that look suspiciously like real people, which has a huge connotations and associations with laws that I won't get into now, and is internationally, of course, very differently handled. But yeah, the child doll industry is, of course, not a very popular subject anywhere, and I think there's just no willingness to discuss this in any forms of real facts.
Mm-hmm.
If I say, I think it's quite telling that this is kind of huge part of it that no one wants to speak about, really. As you say, it's very unpalatable and so on, but it's just, so everyone would rather, you know, talk about cryogenics and so on, but actually that this massive thing in the middle is very much not post-human. You know, it has everything to do with the worst possible things we can think of when we think about those unpleasant aspects of humanity. Actually, as you asked the question, I remembered that Ron Lord character in Frankenstein. He's a most wonderful, you know, horrible character, basically. And one thing he does say, he sees business opportunities everywhere, obviously, because everyone wants a sex bot. And one thing he says, absolutely, he has this art of sort of just saying the worst possible things in a super blunt way, but it's so blunt in a way that it sort of ends up, you know, circling the loop and making sense. And one thing he does say is he says he's thinking of creating little, you know, boy dolls for priests, and he says each priest should have a boy doll, and that way, you know, that huge problem would be just solved in a jiffy like that. And besides that, you know, the shock value of the reflection. I was thinking, what's interesting is that you're saying there's very little research on this, but I think as humanities people, this is all people working on mimesis, this is all we've been working on since Aristotle, the sort of bias, the binary between catharsis and influence. Does art, does imitation, does this way of sort of emulating ourselves, does it mean that we can cathartically sort of discharge our worst possible instincts on creatures that look like us but are not us? Is that cathartic, or does that just bring us into this loop of escalating violence?
It's an interesting thought for sure. I do like your comments about this Lord character, because he actually reminded me of the industry people I've met. It's not that far-fetched. It is, I think, maybe one of the last actual taboos even in scientific discourse we have. It's just unpleasant to think about. But yeah, I do think, I'd like to think I might have shown that it is cathartic. It is definitely in some way emotionally reactive to interact with these artificial bodies. We cannot reliably psychologically distinguish between them and real humans. And I do think that should have some sort of consequence. Mainly because, as I've mentioned, we do have a weird persistence in hurting these characters.
Thank you. Heike Missler?
Yes,
you have a question.
it's Heike. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for your papers. I really enjoyed them tremendously. I have a very sort of amorphous question, I'm afraid, for Diane and Bettina. And it's about common representational patterns of AI. And I was just thinking, I think there's amazing sort of interconnections between all of the three papers, but one thing that struck me is this, so the pattern that stands out, I think, in Frankissstein is this metaphor of AI and the child, right? And sort of the creators of AI as parents, which obviously is super creepy when you think back to the baby sex dolls, right? So maybe that's also sort of another connection to Bettina's paper. And I was just thinking about the heteronormativity of that trope, and whether there's any potential to queer this idea, and whether you see that in Frankissstein at all. Diane, that's sort of your part of the amorphous question, sorry. And then for Bettina, I think the representational pattern that you say is most striking is this idea that, there's violence done to AI so as for humans to understand sort of where the boundaries are between us and them. And again, I guess I was kind of thinking back to the idea of, if you link the metaphor of the AI as a child and the creators as parents, how does that make sense within your research? And I guess, are there any other common representational patterns that you've spotted so far in your primary texts? Sorry, it's such a long question.
Bettina, do you want to answer, or should I start? Good. Yes, so thank you for your question. Obviously, there is something, well, I mean, there's something heteronormative in that connection between, in that model of AI as the child. If you stay within the bounds of the idea that you only make children with, a man and a woman, and something happens between them, that's definitely not, I mean, at least in Frankenstein, as I try to sort of start showing, I think Winterson is trying to look at different ways of doing that. So she's there's this whole, and I think that, sorry, my answer is going to be very amorphous now. So I think one basic thing is, first, in the heterosexual couple, and I mean, it's quite rare for there to be heterosexual couples at all in Winterson. I feel that she's and I think it is significant in itself that she's sort of, just because she's looking at the Shelleys as a heterosexual couple, doesn't mean that she sort of tries to, that she's going back to, oh, you know, let's just think about how it was wonderful in the 19th century when people just had babies. I think the way she sort of queers that is she does present this kind of completely fictional version of Percy as a father who's clearly not acting as a father figure, you know, capital F and so on. She also really works. I think one of the ways in which she really tries to queer that is through the again, sort of the role that Mary Shelley takes on as a storyteller. And there's this whole sense throughout the novel that because stories as a sort of are a sort of predecessor of AI, you know, it's all about creating something, imagining something that will work as a child. Then when you create a story, you're both the father and mother of the story. That's what Percy says to Mary, you know, you're the mother and father of this thing because you're doing it on you've created it on your own. And so I think ultimately the idea is more of the notion of the child as an entire person, completely separate from their parents, and therefore, you know, able to go out into the world and emancipate and develop. In a way that is that parents can try to influence, but ultimately won't have any, you know, any hand on. And I think that's what she's trying to do. The other way in which this is this notion of you know, cutting sexual relations, the heterosexual relations, I guess, from babies. The other way this is introduced in the novel is obviously that you know, Vitzthum and Mary Shelley technically have sex that looks like heterosexual sex because Mary Shelley hasn't had an operation, so he has a vagina, and he really sort of systematically positions himself on this kind of liminal space of feeling entirely female at times, but also feeling like a man, and feeling that he is a man, and those relations will, you know, clearly not bring forth any children. And so I think that's one of the ways in which maybe that queering of those relations might be achieved, is that you also have you know, pardon my French, fannies and penises coming together, and they won't create any children because that's not the point. Hope that makes sense.
Also, if you read the creation of the creature as a sort of non-sexual procreation act, isn't that a sort of queer act in itself, in that it emancipates procreation from the biological sphere?
Yeah, but it's not entirely, I mean, yeah, what's interesting partly is that she doesn't go all the way, you know, into that kind of, because that's also a male fantasy of not having to go through the female body, you know, not having to depend on women to produce babies. So I think there's something very moving actually in the way that she sort of goes into that territory of, well, actually a lot of, you know, most human bodies are still being produced by female bodies, but she goes into that territory without sort of without sort of retreating into this super heteronormative notion of what motherhood might be. And I mean, if you've read, you know, Winterson's Over and her fascination with adoptive motherhood and so on, that all chimes in perfectly with what she does with that.
Your question was, if do correct me if I don't paraphrase you correctly, but whether the metaphor of the AI as child holds up in what I've talked about concerning violence onto the artificial body, right? I do think it does hold up, though do please not ask me what it means. I would argue, and I've read this interpretation during my research a lot, that raising children can actually be considered programming that, and you could extend that to a sort of artificial process that might be even violent at times, and it has been historically literally violent, of course. And I'd say because of that, the metaphor does hold up, that these artificial bodies we create could be our children. And it is curious in that context that a lot of these fictional versions of these events actually end up with the AIs or the androids replacing humanity. It has been a thing in sci-fi literature since the 20s that humanity actually goes extinct completely and is replaced by an android race, which is, of course, if we look back at the metaphor that these are actually our children, what happens in real life. So that is something that is definitely in there content-wise.
Thank you. Yep, that was pretty much what I was asking about. And also about, like, are there any other common representational patterns that you've come across so far in your research, apart from the child metaphor and the violence, in order to find out whether or not sort of trope?
Several, actually. I've sort of categorized it as humanity as a corporeal identity, as a emotional identity, a social identity, and weirdly enough, a creative identity, because that are the 4 categories that I've come across the most often. Yeah, there are patterns there. Food is something, weirdly enough, that comes up a lot, I think because it has a social and also like a corporeal aspect. But yeah, this is, I think, a artistic field that lives on patterns, and these are patterns that basically exist since Pygmalion.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one last question from Jane Alexander. So a question for Bettina. Do you have thoughts on how sympathy and empathy might extend between humans and robots that are not anthropomorphic? And is this something you're considering as part of your research?
I don't, simply because I don't have time. It is, you have a extensive embarrassment of riches already when it comes to this, because we've been imagining these things for so long. But I think the Kate Darling quote that that I showed earlier shows that it doesn't necessarily have to be like obviously anthropomorphic. The robot, the military robot that I talked about, for example, was modeled after a stick insect. But even those tiny things that are sort of that read as alive to us, I think that is the lowest common denominator. If we think something is alive, even if we know it isn't, but it registers emotionally to us as alive, then we can relate to it. It's amazing, actually, what humans bond with in a pinch.
Great. I think that's it for today. Diane, do you want to add something?
I mean, I'm not going to add anything so much as to just thank everyone for being here today. Thank our wonderful 2 speakers again, and assure our next speakers how much we're waiting and looking forward to waiting for next week. Looking forward to next week I can't speak anymore. So yeah, thank you so much for being here, for what I feel has been a very interesting, very stimulating beginnings of our little webinar adventure together. And yeah, wishing you all a great weekend, and we'll see you all next week then. Same time, same space.
Thank you for the last quote, Bettina. I love it. It's incredible what we can bond with.
Yeah. In a pinch. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.